The right cyclone engine coughed black smoke as Ensign Albert K Earnest fought to keep his Grumman TBF Avenger level at 4,000 feet. The morning of June 4, 1942, had begun with confidence. It would end with revelation. Behind him, in the cramped belly of the aircraft, aviation radioman third class Harry Ferrier pressed his hand against a wound and tried not to look at Seaman J. Manning, who no longer moved in the dorsal turret. The intercom was dead. The hydraulics were gone. The compass spun uselessly. Earnest could feel bullets embedded in the armor plate behind his seat, could see daylight through holes in his windscreen where Japanese 20mm cannon shells had torn through the plexiglass. He was 25 years old. He had never seen combat until 2 hours earlier. Now he was flying a dying aircraft toward an island he could not navigate to, with instruments that no longer functioned and controls that responded only when he manipulated them, and trim tabs with the delicacy of a surgeon. The Torpedo was gone, dropped somewhere over the Japanese fleet in an attack he barely remembered through the chaos of tracer fire and exploding aircraft. Of the 6 TBF Avengers that had taken off from Midway Island that morning, his was the only one still airborne. He did not yet know this. He knew only that he was alive, that his aircraft was somehow still flying, and that if he could find Midway in the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, he might survive the next hour. The revelation would come later, when maintenance crews counted the holes in his aircraft and engineers examined what should have been a flying coffin. It would come when other pilots looked at the damage and shook their heads, when commanders wrote reports trying to explain how any human being had brought such a machine home. But in that moment, at 4,000 feet over the Pacific, with the sun climbing toward noon, Ensign Earnest knew only one truth. He was flying, the most modern torpedo bomber in the United States Navy's inventory, and it had nearly gotten him killed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Grumman TBF Avenger represented everything the Navy believed about naval aviation in 1942. It was the replacement for the Douglas TBD Devastator, an aircraft that had entered service in 1937 and was already obsolete by the time war came to the Pacific. The Avenger was supposed to change everything. It was larger than its predecessor, measuring 40 feet and 3 inches from propeller spinner to tail, with a wingspan of 54 feet and 2 inches. Where the Devastator had been cramped and underpowered, the Avenger boasted a Wright R2 608 Cyclone engine producing 1,700 horsepower, driving a 3-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller nearly 14 feet in diameter. The aircraft weighed 10,555 pounds, empty swelling to more than 15,000 pounds when loaded with fuel, crew, and ordnance. It could carry a single Mark 13 torpedo weighing 2,000 pounds, or up to 4 500-pound bombs in its internal bomb bay. This internal bay was itself an innovation. Previous torpedo bombers carried their weapons externally, creating enormous drag that reduced speed and range. The Avenger's designers had built the weapon bay into the aircraft's belly, with hydraulically operated doors that sealed flush with the fuselage in flight. The crew consisted of 3 men. The pilot sat up front in an enclosed cockpit with adequate visibility and modern instruments. Behind him, separated by the bomb bay, the radioman bombardier occupied a small compartment with a flexible 30-caliber machine gun pointing downward and rearward. Above and behind the radioman, the gunner manned an electrically powered turret mounting a single 50-caliber Browning machine gun. This turret could rotate 360 degrees, giving defensive coverage against attacking fighters from nearly any angle. The Navy had placed its first production order for 286 Avengers in December 1940, before the prototype had even flown. This reflected both confidence in Grumman's design capabilities and desperation to replace the Devastator. The first prototype, designated XTBF-1, took to the air on August 7, 1941. 4 months later, on December 7th, the second prototype was being prepared for a public unveiling at Grumman's new manufacturing facility in Bethpage, New York. That ceremony was interrupted by news from Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had attacked. The United States was at war. Production accelerated. By early 1942, Grumman was delivering finished aircraft at an increasing rate. Torpedo Squadron 8, assigned to the carrier USS Hornet, was selected as the first unit to receive the new bomber. In May 1942, as intelligence reports indicated a major Japanese operation developing in the Central Pacific, a detachment of VT-8 pilots remained at Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia, taking delivery of the squadron's new Avengers while Hornet deployed to the Pacific, with the rest of the squadron still flying Devastators. Lieutenant Harold Larson commanded this detachment, training his pilots on an aircraft most had never seen before. Among these pilots was Ensign Albert Earnest, a young man from Richmond, Virginia, who had joined the Navy 6 months earlier. Earnest was not a career military man. He had studied at Virginia Military Institute before the war, earning a commission through the Reserve Officer Training Program. He was competent, careful, and utterly inexperienced in combat. This was true of most American naval aviators in the spring of 1942. The peacetime Navy had been small. The expansion following Pearl Harbor brought thousands of new pilots, navigators, and aircrewmen into service, men who had trained quickly and deployed immediately to units that desperately needed them. On June 1, 1942, Lieutenant Langdon Feeberling received orders to lead 6 TBF Avengers from Pearl Harbor to Midway Island, a distance of approximately 1,200 miles over open ocean. The flight itself would be a significant achievement. The pilots selected for this mission had minimal navigation experience. None had ever flown out of sight of land. To assist them, 2 experienced navigation officers from Patrol Squadron 24 were assigned as temporary crewmen, replacing the regular radiomen who would normally occupy those positions. Ensign Jack Wilker and Ensign Joseph Hissam would guide the formation across the Pacific, using dead reckoning and celestial navigation. The 6 Avengers departed Pearl Harbor on the morning of June 1st. They flew in 2 3-plane elements, maintaining formation as they headed west-northwest toward Midway. The flight took approximately 7 hours. The pilots managed the fuel carefully, leaning the mixture to maximize range, watching their instruments as the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific passed beneath them. When they finally spotted Midway, a tiny speck of coral and sand in an ocean that seemed to stretch forever, relief flooded through the formation. They had made it. Midway Island was not much to look at. The atoll consisted of 2 small islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, surrounded by a coral reef. The total land area was barely 2 square miles, but Midway's strategic importance far exceeded its size. Located 1,150 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, the atoll served as an advance base for American forces in the Central Pacific. It had an airfield, fuel storage, defensive positions, and a garrison of Marines and Navy personnel. In early June 1942, Midway also had something else. It was the target of a major Japanese operation designed to draw out and destroy the American carrier fleet. American intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, knew the attack was coming. He knew when it would arrive and roughly what forces the Japanese would commit. He deployed every available carrier to ambush the Japanese fleet northeast of Midway. USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, and USS Hornet took up positions, waiting, but Midway itself would have to withstand the initial Japanese assault, and its defenders prepared as best they could with the forces available. The 6 TBF Avengers represented the newest, most capable aircraft on the island. The rest of Midway's air strength consisted of obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, and a handful of Army B-26 Marauders that had been ferried in from Hawaii. Against this hodgepodge of defenders, Japan was bringing 4 fleet carriers with over 250 aircraft, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Americans on Midway knew they were facing overwhelming force. They prepared to fight anyway. Ensign Earnest and his fellow Avenger pilots spent June 2nd and 3rd familiarizing themselves with Midway's facilities, conducting practice flights, and preparing their aircraft for combat. They loaded Mark 13 torpedoes into the bomb bays, checked the electrical systems, test-fired the guns. The turret gunner assigned to Earnest's aircraft was Seaman J. Manning, a young man who had trained extensively on the 50 caliber Browning but had never fired it in anger. The radio man was Aviation Radio Man 3rd Class Harry Ferrier, slightly built and barely out of training himself. Like most of the men on Midway that first week of June, Ferrier was young, inexperienced, and about to be tested in ways no training could prepare him for. The Japanese doctrine for carrier operations in 1942 was the product of years of training and operational experience. They had perfected the art of massed carrier strikes during operations in China and in the opening months of the Pacific War. Their carriers operated in concentrated formations, allowing them to mass overwhelming air power against any target. Their pilots were among the best in the world, veterans of combat in China and extensive peacetime training. Their aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi Zero fighter, had demonstrated clear superiority over most Allied aircraft in the early months of the war. The Japanese plan for Midway followed established doctrine. The carriers would approach from the northwest, remaining outside the range of American land-based aircraft. At dawn on June 4th, they would launch a massive strike against Midway's airfield and defenses, suppressing American air power and preparing the way for an amphibious assault. A second wave of aircraft would be held in bases reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs to attack any American ships that appeared. The Japanese did not know that American carriers were already in the area, waiting in ambush. They believed the carriers were still near Pearl Harbor, too far away to intervene. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic, but in the pre-dawn hours of June 4th, as Japanese carriers turned into the wind to launch aircraft, the plan seemed sound. The strike wave took off in near-perfect formation, heading south toward Midway. Behind them, the second wave waited on the carrier decks, armed and ready. On Midway, radar operators detected the incoming strike at approximately 0530 hours. The range was 93 miles and closing. Air raid sirens wailed across the atoll. Every aircraft capable of flight was ordered into the air. Fighters scrambled to intercept the Japanese bombers. Bombers and torpedo planes were ordered to attack the Japanese carriers, striking before the enemy could recover their returning aircraft. It was the only way to disrupt the Japanese plan and give the defending fighters a chance. At 0600 hours, Lieutenant Feeberling led his 6 Avengers into the air from Eastern Island's runway. They formed up and turned northwest, toward where the Japanese carriers were estimated to be. 4 Army B-26 Marauders joined them, also armed with torpedoes. The 10 aircraft represented Midway's entire torpedo strike capability. They flew without fighter escort. There were no fighters to spare. Ensign Earnest took his position in the formation, Manning in the turret behind him, Ferrier in the belly position below. The new Avenger felt solid, powerful. Earnest could feel the deep throb of the Cyclone engine through the airframe, could see the other aircraft holding formation around him. They climbed to altitude as they flew northwest, searching the horizon for the enemy fleet. At approximately 0655 hours, Ensign Earnest saw what appeared to be the entire Japanese navy spread across the ocean ahead. 4 large carriers were visible, surrounded by a screen of cruisers and destroyers that seemed to stretch for miles. The sky above the fleet was filled with aircraft, fighters maintaining combat air patrol, while the strike wave recovered aboard the carriers. It was the most powerful naval force anyone in the American formation had ever seen. Lieutenant Feeberling led the Avengers down in their attack approach, diving from 4,000 feet toward the release altitude of 200 feet. This was standard torpedo doctrine. The Mark 13 torpedo was fragile. It required release at low speed, low altitude, and relatively close range to function properly. The attacking aircraft would have to fly straight and level for the final approach, presenting an easy target for both fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Every man in every aircraft knew the odds. They attacked anyway. The Grumman TBF Avenger that Ensign Earnest flew that morning bore bureau number 00380. It was the first aircraft off Grumman's production line, delivered to the Navy in January 1942. The aircraft weighed 7,440 pounds empty. Loaded with crew, fuel, ammunition, and the Mark 13 torpedo, The weight increased to 15,205 pounds. The Wright R2-608 engine produced its maximum power of 1,700 horsepower at 1,800 revolutions per minute, turning the propeller at a maximum speed of 2,200 revolutions per minute through a reduction gearbox. The fuel system held 335 gallons of aviation gasoline in self-sealing tanks. At cruise power settings, the engine consumed approximately 70 gallons per hour, giving the aircraft an endurance of roughly 4.5 hours. The oil system held 28 gallons in a tank mounted in the forward fuselage, feeding oil to the 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows around the crankcase. The hydraulic system operated the landing gear, the bomb bay doors, the wing flaps, and the tail hook. Hydraulic pressure was maintained at 1,500 pounds per square inch by an engine-driven pump. If the hydraulic system failed, emergency systems allowed manual extension of the landing gear using a hand crank located in the cockpit. The armament consisted of 150 caliber Browning M2 machine gun mounted in the upper right side of the engine, cowling, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. The turret mounted another 50 caliber weapon with 500 rounds of ammunition stored in a box feed system. The ventral position carried a single 30 caliber Browning with 500 rounds. The Mark 13 torpedo weighed 2,116 pounds, measured 22.4 inches in diameter, and was 13 feet and 5 inches long. It carried 600 pounds of Torpex explosive in its warhead. When launched properly at altitudes below 100 feet and speeds below 130 miles per hour, the torpedo would enter the water, stabilize at a preset depth of approximately 12 feet, and run toward the target at speeds up to 33 knots for approximately 6,000 yards. The problem was that proper launch conditions were nearly impossible to achieve in combat. The attacking aircraft had to slow to dangerous speeds while flying straight and level at wave-top altitude, usually through intense anti-aircraft fire and against defending fighters. The TBD Devastator had been slaughtered attempting such attacks. The Avenger was faster, tougher, and better armed than the Devastator, but it still had to fly the same attack profile against the same defenses. Speed and armor meant nothing during the final approach, when the aircraft was committed to the torpedo run. Ensign Earnest had received approximately 40 hours of flight time in the TBF during training at Norfolk. He had practiced torpedo drops against target sleds towed by tugboats in Chesapeake Bay. He had flown formation flights, navigation exercises, and gunnery practice. He had never dropped a torpedo in combat. He had never been shot at by an expert enemy pilot flying one of the most maneuverable fighters in the world. None of his training had prepared him for what was about to happen. The Mitsubishi A6M Type 0 fighter was the dominant naval fighter in the Pacific in June 1942, powered by a Nakajima Sakai 14-cylinder radial engine producing 940 horsepower. The Zero weighed 4,136 pounds empty and climbed to 20,000 feet in approximately 7.5 minutes. It could reach a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour at 16,000 feet. More importantly, it could turn inside any American fighter, then, in service, could climb faster and had phenomenal range. The armament consisted of 2 7.7mm machine guns mounted in the forward fuselage and 2 20mm cannon in the wings. Japanese pilots flying Zeros over Midway on the morning of June 4th were veterans of campaigns in China, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. They had shot down hundreds of Allied aircraft. They knew their aircraft's capabilities intimately and flew with the confidence born from months of unchallenged air superiority. When they spotted the formation of 10 torpedo bombers approaching their fleet, they attacked with practiced precision. The first Zero made its firing pass on the American formation at approximately 0705 hours. The pilot rolled into position behind and above the trailing B-26, fired a burst from both cannon and machine guns, and watched the bomber explode. A second Zero attacked another B-26, raking it with cannon fire, until smoke poured from one engine. The bomber continued flying but fell out of formation, losing altitude. The Zeros then concentrated on the TBF Avengers. Ensign Earnest saw tracers streak past his cockpit. He heard the distinctive sound of 20mm cannon shells hitting his aircraft, a sharp crack followed by tearing metal. The windscreen directly in front of him spider-webbed as a shell passed through it without detonating, the plexiglass fragmenting but holding together. Another shell struck the armor plate behind his seat. He felt the impact through the airframe. Behind him, Manning opened fire with the turret gun, the .50 caliber weapon hammering as he tracked a Zero that flashed past. The sound inside the aircraft was overwhelming. Engine roar, wind noise through holes in the fuselage, the staccato bark of the machine guns, and the periodic crack of cannon shells finding their mark combined into a chaos of sound that made communication impossible. The intercom went dead. Earnest tried calling Manning and Ferrier but received no response. He was alone now, flying by instinct and training as Zeros swarmed around the formation like hornets. He saw another Avenger to his left suddenly nose down, trailing fire. The aircraft hit the water and disintegrated. A third Avenger exploded in mid-air, torn apart by concentrated fire from multiple Zeros. The formation that had seemed so solid minutes before was dissolving into chaos. Individual aircraft scattered, each pilot trying to survive long enough to reach the fleet and drop his torpedo. Lieutenant Feebling pressed on toward the carriers. Earnest followed, still maintaining formation despite the damage accumulating on his aircraft. The hydraulic system failed. Red warning lights illuminated on the instrument panel. The bomb bay doors, which should have opened automatically when he selected the release switch, remained closed. Without hydraulics, they would not open. The torpedo could not be dropped. Earnest realized he was flying a doomed aircraft toward a heavily defended fleet while carrying a 2,000-pound explosive device that he could not release. The climax of reality, the turning point. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire opened up at approximately 3,000 yards. The Americans were now close enough that the fleet's light anti-aircraft guns could engage. 25mm machine cannon began firing, their shells creating black puffs in the air around the attacking aircraft. Heavier 5-inch guns from the destroyers joined in, firing time-fused shells that exploded in airbursts. The sky became a maze of steel and fire that the torpedo bombers had to fly through to reach their release points. Earnest dove toward the release altitude. He was committed now. The carrier Hiryu filled his forward vision, growing larger with each second. He could see aircraft on the deck, could see sailors running to battle stations. The ship began a turn to port, trying to present a narrow profile to the incoming torpedoes. Japanese doctrine called for violent maneuvering when under torpedo attack. The carriers were fast, capable of speeds exceeding 30 knots, and could turn tightly for vessels of their size. Avoiding torpedoes launched from long range was relatively simple if the ship's captain was alert and experienced. At 500 feet altitude, another Zero made a firing pass. This time, the pilot approached from directly ahead, a head-on attack that gave both aircraft only seconds of firing opportunity. The Zero's pilot fired a long burst. 20mm shells walked up the nose of the Avenger, striking the engine cowling, the windscreen, the canopy structure. One shell struck the instrument panel, destroying the compass and airspeed indicator. Another shell penetrated the cockpit and struck the control yoke, fragmenting and sending shrapnel across the interior. A piece of metal struck Earnest in the neck, a shallow wound that bled but did not incapacitate him. The Zero flashed past, missing collision by feet. Earnest held the aircraft steady, still diving toward the release point. He was at 200 feet now, close enough to see individual sailors on the carrier's deck pointing upward at him. The anti-aircraft fire intensified. Tracers from multiple gun positions converged on his aircraft. He could feel impacts, could hear metal tearing, but the Cyclone engine continued running and the aircraft continued flying. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At 150 feet, Earnest finally reached the emergency bomb bay door release. This mechanical system, independent of the hydraulic system, would blow the doors open using explosive charges. He pulled the handle. The doors separated from the airframe and fell away. The torpedo, no longer secured, dropped free. Earnest did not see where it went. He was already pulling back on the control yoke, using every bit of remaining elevator authority to bring the aircraft's nose up and avoid flying directly into the ocean. The Avenger shuddered as he pulled through the bottom of the dive. The airframe groaned under the G-forces. Earnest heard something tear in the tail section, but the aircraft remained controllable. He rolled into a shallow turn to the left, trying to open the distance from the Japanese fleet. Behind him, in the turret, J. Manning was no longer firing. Harry Ferrier, in the belly position, was trying to understand what had happened. One moment he had been firing at fighters attacking from below and behind. The next moment something had struck him, pain exploding in his jaw and head. He had been knocked unconscious briefly. When he came to, his face was covered in blood and he could not move his jaw properly. A shell fragment had struck him, breaking bones and tearing tissue. Ferrier tried the intercom again. Nothing. He could not contact Earnest or Manning. He did not know if they were alive or dead. He remained at his position, scanning for enemy fighters, ready to fire if any approached. But the Zeros were no longer pursuing. They had turned back to defend the fleet against other attackers. Earnest's Avenger, trailing smoke and obviously damaged, was no longer a threat worth chasing. At approximately 07:20 hours, Earnest realized he was north of the Japanese fleet, between the enemy and Midway. Every instrument that required either hydraulic pressure or electrical power was dead. The compass was destroyed. The airspeed indicator did not function. The altimeter still worked, as it operated on static pressure alone, but that was his only remaining instrument. He tried the radio. Dead. The electrical system had failed when cannon shells severed wiring harnesses in the forward fuselage. He looked back through the small window that allowed the pilot to see into the crew compartment. He could see Ferrier moving, which meant at least one of his crew members had survived. He could not see Manning in the turret. The turret was still trained to port, frozen in position when the hydraulic system failed. Manning was not visible. Earnest tested the controls carefully. The rudder responded normally. The ailerons worked, though they felt heavy, requiring more force than usual to move. The elevator was completely non-functional. The control yoke moved forward and backward but produced no response from the aircraft. Somewhere in the tail section, control cables had been severed or the elevator surfaces themselves had been damaged. Without elevator control, the aircraft could not pitch up or down using normal inputs, but the elevator trim tabs still worked. These small surfaces, adjusted by a hand wheel in the cockpit, normally provided minor adjustments to control forces. Now they were his only way to control the aircraft's pitch attitude. Earnest experimented carefully. He rolled the trim, wheel forward. The nose dropped slightly. He rolled it back. The nose came up. The response was slow, requiring many seconds for each adjustment to take effect, but it worked. He could fly the aircraft using rudder for heading control, ailerons for bank control, and trim tabs for pitch control. It was awkward, imprecise, and required constant attention, but it was flyable. The revelation of mortality came gradually, not in a single moment. Earnest climbed carefully to 4,000 feet using the trim tabs, a process that took nearly 10 minutes. At that altitude, he could see farther, could search for any landmark that might guide him back to Midway. The sun was in the eastern sky, still relatively low. That gave him one reference point. Midway lay southeast of the Japanese fleet. If he flew south, then adjusted eastward, he should eventually intercept the atoll. The problem was distance. Midway was at least 200 miles away, possibly more depending on how far the Japanese carriers had advanced during the night. His fuel state was unknown. The fuel gauges were electrical and no longer functioned. He had no way to know how much gasoline remained in the tanks. The aircraft flew with an odd motion, one wheel hanging down from the left landing gear well. The hydraulic failure had caught the gear in mid-retraction. The left main gear was down and locked. The right main gear and the tail wheel remained retracted. This asymmetric configuration created additional drag and made the aircraft want to roll left constantly. Earnest had to hold right aileron pressure to keep the wings level. His right arm began to ache from the constant strain. At 4,500 feet, he leveled off and adjusted course toward where he estimated Midway to be. The ocean below was empty, a vast expanse of blue water without ships, without aircraft, without any feature to provide reference. Flying over the ocean without instruments was like flying blind. There was no way to judge speed, no way to judge distance, no horizon reference when clouds obscured the meeting of sea and sky. Pilots in such conditions often became disoriented, losing track of which way was up, entering spirals without realizing it until the ground rushed up to meet them. Earnest focused on the trim tabs and the rudder, making small adjustments to keep the aircraft stable. He glanced back occasionally through the small window, trying to see if Ferrier was all right. He could see movement, which was reassuring. But Manning remained motionless in the turret, and Earnest began to accept that his gunner was dead. The wound in his own neck had stopped bleeding, clotting over despite the wind blast through the shattered windscreen. His flight suit was soaked with blood, but the injury was superficial. He would survive if he could get the aircraft back to Midway. 30 minutes passed, then 45. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Earnest held his heading as best he could, making adjustments based on the sun's position. He watched the ocean below for any sign of ships, friendly or enemy. He saw nothing. The Pacific lived up to its name, peaceful and empty under the morning sun. At approximately 08:15, he saw smoke on the horizon ahead. Black smoke, the kind produced by burning fuel or structures. Midway was burning. The Japanese strike had hit the island hard, and fires still raged from the bombing. But smoke meant land, meant the airfield, meant survival. Earnest adjusted course toward the smoke. The distance closed slowly. The Avenger, damaged and asymmetric, was flying well below its normal cruise speed. Earnest estimated perhaps 140 miles per hour, possibly less. Each minute seemed to last an hour. He fought fatigue, fought the constant strain of holding control inputs, fought the growing certainty that the fuel would run out before he reached the island. At 08:40, he could see Midway clearly. The atoll was still under attack. Anti-aircraft fire arced into the sky as the Japanese strike wave completed its bombing runs. Fighters wheeled and dived over the lagoon. Earnest needed to land immediately, but approaching Midway while the airfield was under attack was suicidal. The Marines on the ground were firing at anything in the air. His aircraft had no radio to identify itself as friendly. If he approached the island, they would shoot at him. He circled north of the atoll, watching the battle below. Japanese bombers finished their runs and turned northwest, heading back to their carriers. Fighters made final strafing passes on the airfield installations, then followed the bombers. The sky cleared. Earnest waited another 5 minutes to ensure no more attackers were in the area, then turned toward Eastern Island's runway. The approach to landing required careful planning. With only one wheel down, the landing would be asymmetric. The left wheel would touch first, followed by the right wing scraping the lock, in ground when the aircraft slowed enough that the aileron could no longer hold it level. Earnest would have to keep the aircraft as level as possible for as long as possible, then accept the inevitable ground loop when the right wing hit. Without radio, he could not warn the tower of his condition. He simply had to make the approach and hope they understood he was in trouble. At 08:55, Earnest entered the pattern for Eastern Island. He had no flaps, as they were hydraulically operated. He had no airspeed indicator to judge his approach speed. He flew by feel, estimating speed by the wind noise and the aircraft's response to control inputs. He rolled out on final approach at approximately 300 feet altitude, the runway ahead marked by bomb craters and burning structures. The island had taken a beating. Whether the runway was even usable was uncertain, but there was no alternative. He was committed. The left wheel touched runway concrete at approximately 0900 hours. Earnest held the aircraft level using aileron and rudder, the trim tabs set to keep the nose from dropping too quickly. The Avenger rolled down the runway on one wheel, the right wing rising as he fought to keep it airborne. Speed bled off. At approximately 40 miles per hour, aerodynamic control authority disappeared. The right wing dropped. It struck the runway with a grinding screech of metal on concrete. The aircraft pivoted violently to the right, slewing sideways as the wing dug into the surface. The propeller struck the ground, blade tips curling as they hit at hundreds of revolutions per minute. The Cyclone engine, still running, seized as the sudden stoppage torqued the crankshaft beyond its design limits. The Avenger slid to a stop approximately 800 feet down the runway, canted at an angle with its right wing crumpled and fuel leaking from ruptured tanks. Earnest shut off the fuel selector and magnetos, killing any remaining electrical power to prevent fire. He released his harness and stood in the cockpit, his legs shaking from fatigue and adrenaline. Behind him, Harry Ferrier was trying to open the ventral hatch. His face was covered in blood, his jaw broken, but he was conscious and moving. Earnest could not see Manning. The turret, frozen in its port position, blocked his view. Ground crews reached the aircraft within seconds. They helped Earnest climb out through the side hatch, then moved to extract Ferrier from the belly position. A medical corpsman examined Earnest's neck wound, declared it superficial, and began cleaning it. 2 other men climbed up to the turret to retrieve Manning. They found him slumped over his gun, killed by a 20mm cannon shell that had penetrated the turret's thin armor and struck him in the head or chest. He had died quickly, probably never knowing what hit him. His body was removed carefully, respectfully, and taken to the medical station where it would be prepared for burial. Earnest stood beside his aircraft as the initial shock wore off, and the full weight of what had happened began to settle on him. 5 other Avengers had taken off that morning. None had returned. 11 other men were dead or missing. He was alive only because of luck, because Japanese fighters had concentrated on other targets at critical moments, because his aircraft had somehow continued flying despite catastrophic damage. There was no skill involved in survival. He had simply been fortunate. The maintenance officer arrived with a clipboard, ready to assess the damage. He walked around the aircraft slowly, counting holes, examining structural damage, taking notes. The inspection took nearly an hour. When he finished, he approached Earnest with an expression that mixed disbelief and professional concern. The aircraft, he explained, had been struck by at least 9 20mm cannon shells and 64 7.7mm machine gun bullets. The hydraulic lines were severed in multiple locations. The elevator control cables had been cut by shrapnel. The electrical wiring harness was destroyed from the cockpit to the tail. The right wing spar was cracked. The engine had taken multiple hits but had continued running until the crash landing destroyed it. By any reasonable assessment, the aircraft should never have made it back to Midway. Bureau number 00380, the first production TBF Avenger, would never fly again. The damage was too extensive for field repair. Even if it could be repaired, the structural integrity was compromised. The aircraft was written off, declared a total loss. But its value to the Navy had not ended. Orders came down from Pearl Harbor to ship the wreckage back to Hawaii for detailed examination. Engineers wanted to understand how the aircraft had sustained such damage and remained flyable. They wanted to know what had failed and what had kept working. The lessons learned would inform modifications to future production aircraft. At approximately 1100 hours, while Earnest was being debriefed by intelligence officers, the carrier battle northeast of Midway reached its climax. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown caught the Japanese carriers while they were refueling and rearming aircraft. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were struck within minutes of each other, massive bombs penetrating their flight decks and detonating among armed and fueled aircraft on the hangar decks below. All 3 carriers were doomed, consumed by fires that could not be controlled. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that crippled Yorktown, but was herself located and destroyed by American dive bombers that afternoon. By sunset on June 4th, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and over 300 aircraft. The balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted decisively. The torpedo attacks, including Earnest's mission, had achieved no direct hits on Japanese carriers. All of the damage to the Japanese fleet came from dive bombers, but the torpedo attacks had not been useless. They had forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver violently, disrupting their air operations. They had drawn the combat air patrol down to low altitude, leaving the fleet vulnerable when the dive bombers arrived at high altitude minutes later. And they had demonstrated a courage and commitment to mission that would characterize American naval aviation for the rest of the war. The men who flew those attacks knew the odds. They attacked anyway. Earnest received the Navy Cross for his actions on June 4th. The citation recognized both his completion of the torpedo attack against overwhelming opposition and his successful return of the damaged aircraft to Midway. He would later receive a second Navy Cross for actions during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, and a third for operations at Guadalcanal in October. He survived the war, retired from the Navy in 1946, and lived until 1987. In interviews conducted decades after Midway, he was always reluctant to discuss his actions in heroic terms. He had done his job, he insisted. Others had done more. He had simply been lucky. Harry Ferrier spent 3 weeks recovering from his wounds at the Naval Hospital in Pearl Harbor. The broken jaw required surgery and months of healing. He returned to flight status in November 1942, assigned to a new squadron operating from a carrier in the South Pacific. He flew combat missions throughout 1943 and 1944, accumulating decorations and combat experience. Like Earnest, he survived the war. In later years, he became one of the few enlisted veterans of Torpedo Squadron 8 who spoke publicly about the Battle of Midway. He attended commemorations, gave interviews, and worked to ensure that the sacrifice of his squadron mates was remembered. He died in 2012 at age 91, one of the last survivors of that desperate June morning. Jay Manning was buried in the Naval Cemetery on Oahu. He was 21 years old at the time of his death. His family received the Purple Heart and a letter from the Secretary of the Navy expressing the nation's gratitude for his sacrifice. His name appears on the memorial wall at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, one of more than 400,000 Americans who died during the war. The TBF Avenger would go on to become one of the most effective naval aircraft of World War II. By 1945, nearly 10,000 had been produced by Grumman and by General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division. The aircraft participated in every major naval battle in the Pacific theater after Midway. Avengers sank the Japanese battleships Yamato and Musashi, attacked carriers at Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, and hunted submarines throughout the Pacific and Atlantic. The aircraft's ruggedness, demonstrated so dramatically by Earnest's survival, became legendary among crews who flew it. But the lesson of Midway went beyond the capabilities of any single aircraft. The battle demonstrated that courage alone could not overcome material disadvantage. The American torpedo squadrons at Midway achieved almost nothing in terms of direct damage to the Japanese fleet. VT-8, flying obsolete devastators from Hornet, was wiped out completely with only one survivor. VT-6 from Enterprise and VT-3 from Yorktown suffered similar catastrophic losses. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, only 6 returned. 35 aircraft were lost. 53 aviators were killed or missing. These losses would have been meaningless, except for one crucial factor. The torpedo attacks had forced the Japanese to make a fatal decision. When the American carriers were detected northeast of Midway, Japanese Commander Admiral Nagumo had to decide whether to launch his second wave immediately against the newly discovered American ships, or to wait until his aircraft could be rearmed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes more effective against warships than the general-purpose bombs they carried for attacking Midway. He chose to wait, to rearm. This decision left Japanese carriers vulnerable, their decks crowded with aircraft being serviced, fuel lines open, ordnance scattered across the hangar decks. The torpedo attacks arrived during this vulnerable period. They achieved no hits, but they forced the carriers to maneuver, disrupted operations, and drew defensive fighters down to wave-top altitude. When American dive bombers arrived minutes later, they found the Japanese fleet with minimal high-altitude fighter cover and carriers that could not launch additional fighters because their decks were obstructed. The result was catastrophic for Japan. 3 carriers destroyed within 5 minutes, a 4th sunk later that afternoon. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, pilots with years of experience, lost when their carriers went down, or when they were forced to ditch in the ocean as fuel ran out. The Americans learned from Midway. Torpedo tactics were revised. The Mark 13 torpedo underwent modifications to make it more reliable and to allow launch at higher speeds and altitudes. Fighter escorts for strike packages became standard procedure. Coordination between torpedo bombers and dive bombers improved, allowing for simultaneous attacks from multiple directions that overwhelmed enemy defenses. And most importantly, American industrial capacity began to assert itself in ways Japan could never match. The 4 carriers Japan lost at Midway represented approximately 1/3 of its frontline carrier strength. They could not be replaced quickly. Japanese shipyards were already operating at capacity. Resources were limited. The skilled workers needed to build complex warships were in short supply. Japan would not commission another large fleet carrier until mid-1944, 2 years after Midway. Even then, the carrier would be hampered by lack of aircraft, lack of pilots, and lack of fuel. America, by contrast, had barely begun to mobilize its industrial capacity when Midway was fought. The Essex-class fleet carrier program, authorized in 1940, would deliver its first ship in December 1942. By the end of 1943, 7 Essex-class carriers were in service. By the end of the war, 17 had been commissioned with 7 more under construction. Each Essex-class carrier displaced 36,000 tons fully loaded, carried 90 to 100 aircraft, and could sustain operations for extended periods thanks to superior logistics and supply systems. Beyond the fleet carriers, America built escort carriers by the dozens. These smaller ships, converted from merchant hulls or purpose-built on simplified designs, provided air cover for convoys, supported amphibious operations, and trained replacement pilots. By 1945, more than 100 escort carriers were in service. Japan built 7. The disparity in aircraft production was even more dramatic. American factories produced 99,750 aircraft in 1944 alone. Japan's total production for the entire war was approximately 65,000 aircraft across all types. Ensign Ernest's survival, then, represented more than individual luck or skill. It represented the margin that superior equipment and industrial capacity provided. The TBF Avenger was not invincible. 5 of the 6 aircraft that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning were destroyed, but the one that survived, despite catastrophic damage, brought its pilot and 1 crewman home. That margin, multiplied across thousands of engagements throughout the war, made the difference between victory and defeat. The Japanese pilots who attacked the American torpedo bombers at Midway were superbly trained, flying excellent aircraft and executing tactics perfected through years of practice. They achieved an overwhelming tactical victory, shooting down nearly 90% of the attacking torpedo bombers. But their strategic position was already compromised by factors beyond their control. Japan had attacked a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity, limitless natural resources, and a population that would mobilize completely for war. No amount of tactical skill could overcome that disparity in the long term. The Battle of Midway is often called the turning point of the Pacific War. This is accurate, but the turn was not as dramatic as popular memory suggests. Japan remained a formidable opponent for 3 more years. Japanese forces would win battles, sink ships, and exact a terrible price for every island the Americans captured. But after Midway, Japan could never again take the offensive on a strategic scale. The initiative passed to America, and American industrial might ensure that every loss could be replaced, every defeat turned into a lesson for future victory. Bureau number 00380, the battered Avenger that Ensign Earnest flew back to Midway, was crated and shipped to Pearl Harbor in late June 1942. Engineers examined every component, documented every failure, photographed every hole. The lessons learned influenced modifications to production aircraft. Redundant control systems were enhanced. Armor protection was improved in critical areas. The hydraulic system was redesigned with better separation of components to prevent single hits from causing complete system failure. These modifications saved lives in later battles, though the men who benefited would never know about the wrecked aircraft that had informed the improvements. The aircraft itself was eventually scrapped, its aluminum recycled into new aircraft that would carry the war to Japan. But photographs survived, clear images showing the extent of damage the aircraft had sustained. These photographs appeared in training materials, in engineering reports, in historical analyses. They became physical evidence of both the violence of aerial combat and the resilience of well-designed aircraft. Students at flight schools studied the images, absorbing lessons about combat damage and emergency procedures. Engineers used them to validate design decisions and to guide future development. In the end, Earnest's flight on June 4, 1942, lasted approximately 3 hours and 15 minutes from takeoff to landing. In that time, he had flown to contact with the enemy, pressed home an attack through overwhelming opposition, survived catastrophic damage, navigated 200 miles across open ocean without instruments, and executed an emergency landing that should have been impossible. He had done what he was trained to do, what his nation had asked of him, as what his sense of duty demanded. That others had done the same and not survived diminished nothing of their sacrifice. That he had survived to tell the story made him a witness to history, a living reminder of what had been asked of young men in the summer of 1942 and what they had given. The TBF Avenger would serve in every theatre of World War II, from the Arctic to the South Pacific, from the Atlantic to the Philippine Sea. It would sink submarines and battleships, would photograph enemy positions and drop supplies to troops in combat. Future President George H.W. Bush would fly one, nearly dying when his aircraft was shot down over Chichijima in September 1944. Thousands of other pilots and crewmen would serve aboard Avengers, their individual stories mostly forgotten now, absorbed into the vast historical record of a global conflict that killed more than 60 million people. But on Midway Island, on the morning of June 4, 1942, one damaged Avenger had landed safely, carrying 2 survivors of an attack that should have killed them all. The aircraft bore silent testimony to the violence they had endured, to the courage they had shown, and to the simple fact that sometimes, against all odds and all expectations, survival was possible. That was the lesson Bureau number 00380 taught. Not that American aircraft were invincible, but that they were good enough, tough enough, and built in sufficient numbers that even catastrophic losses could be sustained and overcome. In a war of industrial attrition, that margin was everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.